With that, we are so pleased to welcome Dr. Carla Mesquil to TELIC 2023 conference. So Yazdan, would you please go ahead and read the title of Dr. Mesquil's presentation?
Yes, welcome, Dr. Carla Mesquil. Dr. Mesquil would discuss the evolution of online language teaching, what we know and how.
And I'm gonna read a very short bio of Dr. Mesquil. Carla Mesquil is professor at the Department of Educational Theory and Practice at the State University of New York, Albany. Since the first emerged in the 1980s, she has been at the forefront of design, research, and practical training in how digital screens can best be made use of in education. She has established and directed 3 technology research centers at major universities, served as a research and design consultant for industries and institutions, authored and led 9 federal grants in instructional technology, research and implementation, and shared her work around the world. Her publications include numerous books and research articles on digital screen mediation in classrooms, in online instruction, and in educator professional development. Her most current book, Digital Screen Mediation, Agency and Authenticity with Instructional Technologies, examines instructional practices with the screens from a socio-cultural perspective. Dr. Mesquil, thank you so much for accepting our invitation. We are all ears. The floor is yours. You are muted, by the way.
We can see the introductory slide, Dr. Mesquil, but I'm afraid I think you're good to go.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, that's just fine.
Excellent, great, super. Okay, so thank you. Thank you for that great introduction, and thank you for inviting me to speak to your inaugural conference, which sounds like a fabulous endeavor. Congratulations. And today I would like to share with you some of the things that we think we know about online language education and sort of step you through a number of research studies that we've undertaken in the last years and what we've learned. So the major question for the talk and the sort of the outline at the same time is I'm going to talk about what we've learned from 3 decades of teaching languages online. I've been at this for a long time. And secondly, what we have learned more recently from the emergency shift to online language teaching, where we had this tremendous, authentic laboratory of teachers struggling and succeeding in many cases in going online with their language learning and teaching projects. And we'll talk about some of our findings from that era, that quarantine era. And then I'll talk about future directions, particularly what we've learned so far, what the implications are for AI and how AI can become an integral and really exciting part of online language education. So that's the plan. So I have a particular perspective on teaching and learning of languages, teaching and learning in general, and teaching and learning languages in particular. And that is sort of a Vygotskian view that teaching and learning languages is primarily socially mediated, that the core of language learning is interpersonal interactions, using the language in authentic communicative ways. So that's the predominant framework that drives all of the research I'm going to be sharing with you. So the perspective also for this talk is limited to just one of 3 areas that I research. I look at teaching and learning languages with technology, looking at different applications where the student is actually interacting with the technology per se, how teaching and learning happens through technology is what we're going to be talking about today. And then I have also researched the discourse happenings when students and teachers are around the screen. But I don't be
Dr.
talking about that today.
Maskiel,
Yes.
sorry for the interruption. It would be great if you can switch to the slideshow mode so that we can see the slides bigger.
Better?
Ah, that's perfect.
Okay. Did you not see the earlier slides?
We saw them, they were kind of smaller, so this is perfect now.
Okay. Great. Thank you for telling me. Okay. So we're only going to be today talking about the through digital screens and the research that we've been doing on that. So when we're talking about through digital screens, teaching and learning languages through screens, we're talking about when teachers and students communicate online for the purpose of language education and all the myriad rich possibilities that that implies. And the very first project that I'm aware of that actually made use of telecommunications for language learning was a Rio del Rio project. This is back in 1985. It was a project between a classroom in the Boston area, fifth grade kids learning Spanish, and fifth grade kids in Puerto Rico learning English. And the teachers would actually solicit from the kids questions and then go to the big old back computers we had back then, send the message asynchronously, that's all we had. And then the children at the other end would spend a lot of time constructing the appropriate answers in that target language for their pen pals. So this was a very eye-opening application of telecommunications for language education. The children were delighted to use Spanish and English as a second language in this very authentic context. And it was called at the time pen pals on steroids because the children were just so excited that they could have this kind of near synchronous relationship with kids in another language. Early 90s, we had something called news groups, which again was asynchronous. And we experimented with matching up TESOL graduate students, students who were learning how to become ESL teachers, with ESL students who wanted to learn English. And we found out that there was some amazing, very pedagogically strong tendencies that the graduate students were employing that were really appreciated by the ESL students. And it was mostly drawing attention to things. So if you look at the first line, I always think write you by the ESL student. And the graduate student, using simple coloring, says, I think of writing to you too. So she corrects her, informally corrects her, indirectly corrects her. And she does that again in the next line too. And we were just captivated with this idea that rather than calling students out, as we often do in the classroom and correcting them, that these kinds of subtle feedback could happen asynchronously and give students time to really look at what the output was that wasn't correct and what the correct output could be. So early on, a colleague and I, Natasha Anthony, and I started looking at this idea of instructional conversations online. And again, this is asynchronous. We first started asking the very broad question, what instructional conversation strategies are feasible? What can you do with this particular medium that makes these instructional conversations very rich? And our methods of analysis varied. In this particular study in 2004 rather, we did an analysis of asynchronous instructional transcripts and instructor reflections. So this also for a researcher was a big boon because all of a sudden we had all this recordable asynchronous text-based instructional conversation that we could examine and determine what good instructional strategies were and how students responded to them. So out of that study, and this was again quite some time ago, we started to formulate these labels for what we were seeing happen. So we were seeing a lot of saturation where an instructor would repeat the key word that was being studied over and over again in natural, authentic context, in communicative contexts. We saw linguistic tools being promulgated by the teacher, use these ways of manipulating the language, a lot of modeling, just like we do in the regular classroom. The difference in asynchronous, of course, is when you model the target language, it's in text and it can be revisited any number of times for students to look at and explore, repeat, and learn. It's not fleeting as it is in the live classroom. Calling attention to forms also asynchronously, as you saw in the previous example. It takes a little bit of underlining or coloring to let students know to signal to pay attention to particular syntactic forms. Meaningful form-focused feedback also was evident in the prior slide, where the feedback to the student is the actual correct form. And something we started to call corralling, which was forcing the student in a way conversationally to use the target syntactical form or vocabulary or whatever the focus of instruction was, sort of backing them into a corner and forcing them to use the target language in productive, meaningful ways. So this was followed by a couple of other studies, again, looking at forms of online instructional discourse. And we looked at saturation, linguistic tools, modeling, attention to form, and form-focused feedback, and corralling again. And in the second study in 2007, we actually asked students what they had to say about having their attention called to these in instructional conversations, and they were uniformly very positive that this was very helpful to them to be using the target language productively, authentically, while the instructional conversation was steering them to pay attention to what the particular parts of the language they were learning at the time. Just popped up. So then in 2008, we looked at heritage language learners, which in the United States, that means kids who have moved here, who have mastered their home language in the home, but never mastered literacy, and especially academic literacy in that language. So in this case, it was Russian kids who were completely fluent, orally and orally fluent, but lacked the literacy, the being able to read and write and communicate at an academic level. So we, again, posed this research question: what online instructional conversation strategies are most effective in a blended heritage language course? And we analyzed the instructional transcripts and learner reflections. Again, what did the learners have to say about having their attention drawn to particular parts of the language? And again, they were very responsive to this. It seemed to be, and continues to be, a very effective approach when you're dealing with heritage learners and wanting them to be really working with academic language in a manner that they can closely study and revisit and use the language in these asynchronous environments. So the conclusion was, of course, that specific teacher orchestrated synchronous interactions promote L1 academic literacy and skills development for heritage language learners. So in 2011, Gulnara Sadikova and I were asked to do a professional development for EFL teachers. How do you teach online? This was an interesting project in Lithuania with higher education faculty who were forced out of Belarusia to teach in Vilnius, and they had never taught languages online. So we came up with a fishbowl method where the faculty would actually become the learners, and they would be participating as learners in instructional conversations in English. And so they would experience it firsthand and have models of what that looked like. And the research questions were: how do EFL faculty respond to participation in online instructional conversations as professional development? And second, how does such activity contribute to their transition to teaching language online? And the method was asynchronous instruction transcripts that we recorded, and we had intensive interviews with the participants and recorded reflections with them. And the outcome of that was, again, very positive. We found that direct participation in instructional conversations as students works to help unfamiliar teachers experience what online language learning can and should look like. And they were able to experience models of instructional conversations in action rather than hearing about them in abstract. They experienced them firsthand. And the opportunities to compare experiences with colleagues, they also found very valuable. So they had a shared way of talking about online language education, which revolved around instructional conversations. So they reported that their understandings and their confidence to orchestrate these kinds of conversations was greatly augmented. Then in 2014, after synchronous online language education was starting to take off, we started looking at these instructional conversation strategies in live contexts, in synchronous contexts. And in this particular study, we were interested in a new media, new learning perspective that I'll talk about in a second. But here were the research questions for this study. What instructional strategies do instructors envision when designing tasks and assessments for synchronous online sessions? How do they foresee managing individual and group communication and attention during such tasks? A category we used, we labeled design. The second research question was, what instructional strategies do instructors use to build community between and among learners that promotes productive attention and interaction? And that we term pluralism. And three, what instructional strategies do instructors employ to manage online multimodal tools in ways that promote productive attention and interaction? So the synesthesia, we also had this very strong focus on maintaining attention in synchronous environments, which is a challenge. And number four, what instructional strategies do instructors see as simultaneously managing the social, attentional, and instructional goals of language teaching? And our method was we did in-depth interviews with experienced online language educators who taught synchronously in various languages. The instructors supplied and discussed excerpts from their courses that they felt exemplified their practices, and we interviewed them about those. So the perspective for this was the Cope and Calanzas new media perspective. So we looked at these four groups of pedagogy, or dimensions of pedagogy, and how they translated into specific instructional strategies that we would then observe. In terms of design, our expert online synchronous teachers reported the flipped classroom was a boon. They praised the whiteboard as a way of orchestrating instructional conversations quite effectively while drawing student attention and maintaining student attention. There was the poof, it's here phenomenon, which a good teacher, a well-prepared teacher, has a bank of visuals, a bank of references that she can call on to bring up during the synchronous session to maintain student attention and help clarify what's going on. They also had high stakes participation. All the students in the synchronous sessions would become highly involved. So, and this was done by her making it important that they do participate. There was no slacking allowed. She had them all on and working hard throughout the entire synchronous session. In terms of pluralism, the social effective spaces were very important to the teachers. Community cohesiveness that she orchestrated, and always on the ground, having a live tutor was extremely helpful. This is an area that we're researching also, is having a live tutor next to the student as they work through online courses. And there's always the risk of too much information, too much activity that has to be attenuated. In terms of synesthesia, the visual attending was really important, using that whiteboard, using the bank of visuals to keep students' attention, involving them in calling people's attention to visuals that they had on their screens. The nonverbal cueing was very important in orchestrating instructional conversations, and modeling the visual and the oral was also a key strategy that they used. And then finally, from the pedagogical dimension of this model, the focus and model and repeat sequence seemed to be very useful, just like it is in the live classroom, and responding to teachable moments, just like in the live classroom. And in the case of online, capitalizing on the chat feature, which became very, very important in these synchronous courses to keep students engaged and chatting in the target language and getting help. In 2020, my colleagues and I also examined the professional vision of online educators around the world. This was interviews with experienced online language education educators and an international survey. And our teachers in that particular study reported valuing the authentic and multimodal affordances of online teaching, the opportunities for tailored instruction, the highly productive interactions with students that the online environment affords, and interactions that are otherwise not feasible in live classrooms. In another, even more recent study of how teachers learn to teach languages online, we surveyed and interviewed experienced online educators to find out how and what they learned to help them in their teaching. And we had several outcomes, several ways that they reported learning how to teach online, and I can summarize these here. What they learned about online teaching: they learned how to adjust to the medium's affordances and constraints. They learned new patterns of interaction. They learned the importance of student voices and the need for tailored and on-demand support from their institutions. How did they learn these things? They learned from models, looking at other people's courses. They learned from workshops and trainings at conferences or through their institutions. They learned online and in person with their peers. One of the favorite ways reported is to ask the teacher next door or the teacher who happens to be in your Zoom space. So that on-demand request was the most, on-demand information and help was the most popularly reported method of learning how to do this. Taking online courses themselves, they reported, helped them experience what it was like to be an online student. Reading the literature, they read the journals and visited the websites that are prolific on the internet. And of course, good old trial and error. As we all know, in things technological, that's how we learn the most. So that concludes the section of what we knew or thought we knew about online language education before the pandemic. Now we have a whole series of inquiries about what we have learned from our brief experience with emergency remote language teaching. So we started looking at the emergency learning in rural Java, where, as you can see, the connectivity is very spotty. Students would have to go to extraordinary lengths to get any kind of connectivity to do their schoolwork, even going up into trees to try to find bandwidth. So this was in contrast to China, where there was a lockdown for just 3 months, but during those 3 months, the Chinese government mobilized and gave teachers an enormous amount of support to do the online language teaching. One of the supports was they gave them video production studios, very high production video production studios, where teachers could make exemplary videos, not just for their students, but also to share with other teachers around the country. So they developed this large library of exemplary teaching videos that teachers could use both directly share with their students or use as models for their own productions. So in our first study during the pandemic, we asked how did the emergency move online impact teachers' practices? And we interviewed EFL and ESL teachers from the US, China, and Indonesia. And teachers at that time reported that the medium afforded thoughtful observations and responses to students' learning, something that's not always feasible. It's actually not very often feasible in a live situation. That there was a certain reflective time that they could use online before having to respond, especially when they were communicating asynchronously. Excuse me. They also reported that they could focus on productive engagement in the target language. In China, language classes are often 50 children, and it's very hard to orchestrate authentic, productive engagement using the target language. But online, they found that this could happen quite easily and quite well with breakout rooms, with involving parents, doing role plays, having individual time with students in breakout rooms. So there was a lot of innovation that they put to good use. In the case of Indonesia, where there was spotty connectivity, there was also an awful lot of creative response on the part of the teachers and schools using WhatsApp, which is very popular there. So a parent would have a phone and the teacher could connect with the parent to make sure the child is doing their work and giving them exercises that are modified for low bandwidth. They also obviously had students that had higher bandwidth, so they had to accommodate both of them and did that quite well. A second study, pandemic study, looked at how the teaching impacted the knowledge and actions of public school teachers in 3 cultural contexts. We looked again at teachers in Brazil, China, and Indonesia to see how the shift to online learning was affecting their practices. And briefly, their responses where online venues offered a great opportunity for individualized instruction and authentic communication. Again, because of time constraints and space constraints, the focus on individual learners and developing relationships and being able to practice the target language in a more productive way was greatly enhanced. And each teacher worked with, not against, aspects of the medium to meet the specific needs of students. So every affordance they could make use of that helped their students, they would make use of, rather than working against the medium, which in popular media, that seemed to be the message, that teachers were struggling with the technology. But in the case of these teachers, they worked with whatever constraints there were to make the instruction happen well for their students. And finally, more teacher autonomy. In the case of Brazil and Indonesia, the governments suspended standardized testing. So there was this, and the standard curriculum during the lockdown. So teachers all of a sudden had all this freedom and autonomy to make more student-centered materials, orchestrate more student-centered practices. So it says a lot about the value of teacher freedom that we got to experience a little taste of during the pandemic. So let's see. This next study, which is IMPRESS, asked, how did EFL teachers' experiences with affordances and efficiencies of online instruction inform their during lockdown and post-lockdown practices? Now, this was, again, in China, where they had a short 3-month lockdown. And so we tracked 2 teachers intensively through the 3-month lockdown and then followed them through afterwards to see what kinds of changes, if there were any, they made to their instruction based on online teaching experiences. And we found that there were a number of shifts in the kinds of interactivity that they experienced, they orchestrated and experienced the value of during the lockdown. Teacher with students, teacher with parents, parents with students, students with students. As you can see from this graphic, there was limited interactivity before the pandemic, and it got so, they became so accustomed to having these kinds of interactions during the pandemic that they continue to use them now in their teaching. So the forms and purposes of instructional interactions expanded to promote very productive learning and a lot of parental involvement, as you can see. So here's just a very brief summary of some of the pedagogical insights that teachers shared with us. I won't read through them. You can certainly visit them. I'm sure this is going to be recorded somewhere. I can share this with you. These are the affordances that the teachers that we've been working with over these years have pointed out as beneficial and worth working online for. So what we've learned about online language education, we've learned that online instructional strategies, asynchronous, synchronous, and near synchronous, are all highly productive, that these represent tremendous venues for language learning, authentic language learning practice with various orchestrated instructional conversations. So, in short, synchronous and asynchronous instructional conversations can be authentic, contextualized, meaningful, archivable, which is so important because students can return to them over and over again, manipulable, and content rich and content focused. And now I would like to talk a little bit to close about future directions, what these instructional conversation strategies that we see working so beautifully online, what does that look like for the future? And I don't know about you all, but I am so thrilled about AI, and I'm sure that we're going to be talking about that even more at the conference. AI in language education, the possibilities are phenomenal. From an instructional conversation strategy, AI as an assistant to language chunking. Language chunking is when you want to create authentic language and you go through a series of steps to determine, say, a piece of text or a piece of video or audio that has particular syntactic structures in it or particular vocabulary. My students, my graduate students, have been using ChatGPT now for several months to do language chunking using prompts so that they can prepare authentic language learning materials. And it's just an excellent tool for that. And designing those instruction conversations is also something that ChatGPT can do well. You can train it to do modeling. You can train it to do form focused. There's a teacher who recently has been having students engage in a conversation with ChatGPT in the target language, and then go back over the ask ChatGPT to go back over the conversation, highlight any errors that the student may have made, and then the student looks at those errors and then asks ChatGPT to explain why they made those errors. So there's this whole very interesting conversation about the language that a private tutor couldn't even do such a thorough job in such a short time. And then the teacher asked the students to produce those texts, and they talk about them as a class, about the conversation itself, the content of the conversation itself, the form-focused nature of ChatGPT's analysis, and then the explications that ChatGPT supplies for those language errors. So that's just one of many, many possibilities for AI and ChatGPT with instructional conversations. Dr. Anthony and I are also working on virtual learning environments and instructional conversation strategies within virtual learning environments. And chatbots are just perfect for that because they can be conversation partners when you're in an immersive environment and you want to get information about something. So we've been working with chatbots specifically in assessments, assessing online language learning in VLEs. And then finally, I think for teacher professional development and support, there's just nothing better than AI because teachers have a conversation partner. They can talk through. I've talked to many teachers who use ChatGPT to do their lesson planning, their curriculum development, their materials development, and to just have somebody to problem solve that with, somebody to have a voice to problem solve that with is just a very, very excellent part of being a teacher nowadays. And I don't want to go too much longer, but I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Maskiel. We still have, I think, about 20-24 minutes if you want to continue. If not, we can start the discussion. It's up to you.
Okay. I mean, I could say more about teacher professional development and support.
Please.
I don't know where to start. So our teachers right now, as I mentioned, are using it extensively to assist them in their teaching, in all of their teaching. I know in the media, there's a lot of attention being paid to students cheating with ChatGPT, but in language learning, there isn't really any cheating. Because as long as the student is using the language in some productive and meaningful way, that's what we want to have happen. And you'll certainly know if a student hands in a transcript with ChatGPT that isn't theirs. You do get to see their side of the conversation too. If you have them hand in a paper that's written by ChatGPT, I think you would know immediately that it wasn't their own, especially if they're if the language is far above their current level. It's very easy to detect a mismatch there. So I think in my world, when we work with teachers, it makes a lot of sense to ask these kinds of questions about the different roles that the tool can play, and to encourage them to use these different utilities in developing their courses. Certainly looking at student work, as I mentioned earlier, taking a student's written transcript, could be from a speech to text or a written asynchronous contribution to a course. If you take those transcripts and ask ChatGPT to analyze them, I think you'll get a great deal of information about a student's current level of language, where they need to go. And you can even ask ChatGPT to make recommendations about where the student needs to go. So for assessment, it's quite a powerful tool. But I was talking about teacher professional. So I think, yes, encouraging teachers to use it as much as possible as an assistant, a voice, a sounding board, with, of course, the caveat that they check for the veracity of the information that the AI returns to them. I would love to see and I actually asked some of my students to start working on this. I would love to see AI be able to orchestrate instructional conversations. And this is, again, this is something we're also experimenting with the VLE chatbots. So can an AI be guided to model the language that you want modeled? Yes, I think it can. I think I've seen this happen. Can ChatGPT draw attention to errors of form and function, or just form and function? Yes, it can. You can ask ChatGPT to find errors or to underline or highlight whatever portion you're interested in focusing on in instruction. Can ChatGPT corral students into using particular language forms? That's something we're playing with to see if we can come up with the right prompts to make that happen. So yeah, I think the future of instructional conversations for language education and AI, I think it's the perfect marriage. And I think it's a perfect marriage also for teacher professional development, because it gives them a laboratory, it gives them a sandbox, it gives them a partner for them to design and orchestrate and assess their teaching. So I think it's our future is a bright one in the language learning world.
Thank you so much, Dr. Maskeel, for this great keynote speech. We really enjoyed it. So Yazdan, would you please go ahead and start asking the questions that we have received from the audience?
Yes, Dr. Maskeel, thank you so very much for your time, for sharing your thoughts on the evolution of language teaching and learning, of course, the online version. We didn't have time at the beginning of the talk. My name is Yazdan. My last name is Chubsaz. I'm a senior lecturer in English at Sultan Qaboos University here in Oman. We were so happy to have your talk today with us. I want to start the discussion, if you don't mind, by a question from one of our attendees, Robson, who's asking, how are you and your colleagues coping with the students who submit essays that appear to have been created with ChatGPT?
Yes, like I said before, you can tell, especially in a language learning context. If somebody who's an intermediate speaker of French all of a sudden has perfect syntax and form and semantic control in an essay, it's a pretty good clue that it didn't come from them as an original. But that same student who handed that in, if they were directed to take that essay, the ChatGPT generated essay, and modify it, explicate it, make it their own, ask the AI to generate 3 or 4 different versions and compare it. I mean, there's so many different ways you could, as a teacher, you could have the student engage that text even more deeply than they would if they just had to sit down and write a 5-paragraph essay. So you've got the material there to work with the student and ask them to go further. And the beautiful part of it is all through those processes, you're exercising metalinguistic awareness, and you're also exercising second language awareness. And I think it's a great tool for having students think about writing rather than just writing. I think what I'm saying is I think writing with AI is superior to just writing. The old-fashioned way of thinking, it's all in students' heads, or they went and they researched it and got it in their heads and now they have to spit it out. I think with AI, you're going to see much more engagement and looking at text and how it works. How do you put messages together? How does the AI do it? How does your teacher do it? How does a book do it? So genre awareness, meta-genre awareness, meta-linguistic awareness, meta-contextual awareness. I think all of those, there's great potential.
Yes. And given that this AI-based writing and machine learning is a hot topic, one, this is my own question, Dr. Miskil. I was wondering, how would you unpack a little bit more on this? How can AI, let's say from the learner's perspective, for the first part of my question, how can AI help with language chunking? If we can elaborate on that a little bit more, and if we move to the teacher side, how can AI help with the teacher's professional support, as you were discussing? In other words, what is it that AI is adding to the floor, is adding to the field, something that we have not had so far?
Mm-hmm. I think, as I mentioned before, I would call it a conversation partner, a professional development expert conversation partner, right there on demand. So if I'm a teacher and I want to have my students work on cleaning up nuclear waste, right? So I can ask the AI to come up with all the vocabulary, all the syntactic forms, all the semantic nuances of talking about cleaning up nuclear waste. So that would, as a teacher, that would help me a great deal. And then those understandings that I glean that the ChatGPT has generated, I can then use that information as language learning content. I can ask the AI also to take that content and create instructional conversations, or create situations for instructional conversations. And that's something we've been playing around with quite a bit, and it's pretty exciting. So as an instructional partner, as an expert, it's a tool that can help you gather up just about any information. I should check if it's real at this point. Gather up any information and do an analysis on the information and help you transfer that and build on that in your own instructional materials development. That makes a lot of sense. In terms of students chunking, something went wrong. We're trying to get back. Okay. In terms of students chunking, I think that's a really excellent idea. I hadn't even thought of that before. Why not have students ask ChatGPT or AI to generate a story using the real conditional tense or a series of vocabulary words? Have ChatGPT do the chunking, and then the student can come back and orchestrate his own instructional conversations around that. I just think that the possibilities are fabulous. We have sort of this new character in our lives now who can enrich the conversations that we have with students.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you. I mean, before you go on, I want to be Parva Davoudi's voice as well. Parva is one of our attendees, asking, one of my concerns as a teacher is about my students losing their creativity in writing their essays. What are your thoughts in this regard? There is another question from Kamran that I'm going to ask later.
Okay. I think creativity, to me, is central to this whole new getting to know AI. Every time we have a conversation with it, we have to be creative. We also have to be very analytical to look and see what kind of responses we're getting, and be very creative about making the AI do more than we're asking it to. I mean, we asked it to originally. So there is this constant creativity in our own interactions with the AI. And I think you can capitalize on that with your students also. If you model to your students what a creative interaction with the AI looks like, they'll do it. It probably are doing it on their own anyway, outside of school. But I think modeling it for language learning purposes would be an excellent strategy.
Yes, that's correct. And Dr. Miskil, I think Kamran is sharing his thoughts on the learner's competence. He says, I think we should expect the development of the students' ChatGPT competence in near future. Your thoughts on that?
I think they're doing it on their own. I don't think we don't need, it's sort of like video games. We don't need to teach our students how to play video games. We don't need to teach them how to use the internet to search things. These kinds of competencies that they come equipped with are, again, so enriching to our practice. And I think it's the same with ChatGPT or with AI.
They will have their own exposure without us getting involved, I guess.
Exactly. But we want to be involved because we can make them do amazing things with it.
That's what we're discussing here, the teacher side, the learner side, to see both sides. Amin, go ahead, please.
So, Yazan, I wanted to ask one of my own questions for the first time probably during the conference, but I decided to give that opportunity to ChatGPT. So I explained that we are hosting a conference. Dr. Maskil is our keynote speaker. And, I gave a detailed prompt, and this is what ChatGPT would like to ask Dr. Maskil. So I'm going to read this on his or her behalf. Given your expertise in language learning, I would be interested to hear your thoughts on how AI can effectively address the challenges of promoting cultural diversity and socialization in online language education. How do you envision AI technologies contributing to creating inclusive and interactive language learning environments that can foster cross-cultural understanding and meaningful communication? I think that's a very good question.
That's an excellent question. Isn't it an amazing tool? It's just so much
It
fun.
is. I love it.
I don't know if I can even answer. I wish I had my GPT open. I would say, how can I answer this question?
Let the machines talk then.
Exactly. Let the machines. We could go have coffee. They can talk. So I think to promote internationalization, transnationalization, cross-cultural communication, I think the kinds of things that I'm seeing teachers experiment with, where they're having their students query the AI about cultural issues, is someplace to start. So a teacher has, is an Israeli and a Palestinian in her class, and she doesn't know much about the countries. She doesn't know what the problem is. She needs to learn. I think that would be a wonderful resource for her, is to ask ChatGPT. She's going to get a lot more information doing that than Googling. So there's that as a resource for her. And then, of course, as a resource for students to learn about one another. That's certainly something that they could use as a tool for cross-cultural understanding, simply by asking the kind of question you just asked it to come up with. And the other part of your question, was it about cross-cultural differences?
Yeah, I can read that again. It asked, how do you envision AI technologies contributing to creating inclusive and interactive language learning environments that can foster cross-cultural understanding and meaningful communication?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think I have a little bias there. You may have gleaned from my presentation that the instructional conversation is absolutely central to language education. So by promoting those kinds of conversations among students, between and among students, I think that you can promote inclusion and cross-cultural understanding if you have mixed students. If you have a monolingual group of students, you have the wonderful opportunity of having them learn with other students in the host culture online. And certainly ChatGPT could be a wonderful sort of mediator of that. If you took the original 1984 experiment where the kids are talking back and forth, well, imagine having an AI between those two and sort of refereeing and managing that conversation between the Spanish-speaking kids and the English-speaking kids. It could be a great tool. So I like that. I'm really intrigued by that idea of taking cross-cultural collaborations that we've been talking about for years as being very good for language learners and obviously people learning other cultures, and introducing AI in there as a mediator of some kind, as a helper. It's intriguing. Yeah.
Yeah, it's been really interesting working with ChatGPT. So I also asked ChatGPT to answer the question. I said, this is what I asked. I said, how can you, ChatGPT, create inclusive and interactive language learning environments that can foster cross-cultural understanding and meaningful communication? And this is the question that was basically developed by ChatGPT. So it gave me a list of 6 different things that it can do. I'm going to paste that in the chat box and I just read the main points. Number 1 is culturally diverse content. 2, customized learning experiences. 3, real-time feedback and assistance. 4, virtual language exchanges. 5, multimodal learning experiences, and 6, culturally sensitive language usage. So I'm gonna paste that in the chat box in case anyone is interested in reading the details.
Before we wrap the talk up, I wanted to ask Dr. Miskeel another question. This comes from Giti, one of our attendees, who is shedding light on the teacher side as well. Could you please share your thoughts about the effect of over-reliance on AI, let's say in general, ChatGPT in particular, on teachers' creativity?
Over-reliance, I don't know. I don't think anybody's gotten to that point yet where the AI is doing all the work. And I hate to see that ever happen. It just, I tend to trust teachers to be sensible and smart and know the boundaries of what this tool can do and what is important that they do. And I'll emphasize again this idea of it being a supportive tool to a teacher's already extant expertise.
I see. I mean, I
awesome.
think
thank you so much.
You and I were discussing, we did not ask Dr. Miskeel about like how she is, where she is, what project she has in mind now. We did not have the time to just.
Yeah, I think you're in Albany now, yeah?
Right now, I live in Vermont.
Oh, okay.
I don't know if you've been following the news, but we've been having bad flooding here.
Oh my God, sorry to hear that. Yeah.
So I'm very happy to have internet connectivity this morning.
Yeah, I didn't know about that. I was about to say that's a good place to spend your summer. So because Yazdan is in Muscat, Oman, how is the weather like now? Yazdan in Oman.
I would say hot, 50 plus, yeah.
Celsius, which would be like around 100.
2 million Fahrenheit in your language.
So thank you so much, Dr. Miskeel. It was really an honor for us to host you, and we really appreciate all you have done for the field of technology enhanced language learning, and we look forward to having you present at other events and conferences. By the way, do you have any thoughts on what we have started to do regarding this open access free conference? Any thoughts on that?
I think it's a wonderful idea, and bless your hearts for taking on so much organizational and logistical work. Thank you so much for doing that.
My
thanks
pleasure.
For being
I appreciate it a lot.
Yeah, it has been challenging, but definitely joyful. So thank you so much, Dr. Miskeel, and thank you, Yazdan, for all the hard work you have done. So